Romeos have made 3 Civil War visits, 2 to Gettysburg and 1 to Antietam. And later on in the presentation, we'll get what the Romeos did and saw on their visits. I became interested in the Civil War when I was discharged from the Army and asked to join.
Did you fight for the North or the South?
I can't hear you.
Did you fight for the North or the South?
Another announcement. My right hearing aid is in the shop. Yes, I didn't hear it.
He said, did you fight for the North or the South?
Did you fight for the North or the South?
I didn't fight for the North or the South. But anyway, I belong to JWV Post 156, where I met a guy by the name of Ben Kaufman, who won the Medal of Honor in World War I. And he told me
but
that...
you weren't in World War I. Let's not
He told me that the JWV was formed shortly after the Civil War by 3 Jewish war veterans who also won the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now, the Civil War was a 4-year catastrophe that took 620 plus lives.
1,000.
It is too vast an experience to cover in 1 or 2 hours. So I picked out some events and some people not widely reported to talk about. The war was fought to preserve the Union and subsequently, maybe 2 years later, to abolish slavery. Nobody said it better than Abraham Lincoln, who on November 19th, 1863, appeared at the cemetery in Gettysburg to dedicate that cemetery. And he said, and I know all of you know it, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And he concluded the Gettysburg Address, and the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. And you have to remember, before I start this thing, that the North had to win. The South only had to tie. If the South tied, the 2 reasons why we went to war would not have happened. I want to tell you about the Lincoln family. The Lincoln family bought this house for $1,500, and in this house, their 4 sons were born. If you look closely, I don't know if you can see him, but Abe is right here. And he is greeting his neighbors after he won the nomination for the Republican in the Republican Party in 1860. 3 of his sons did not live to adulthood. Eddie died of TB, maybe 3 or 4 years old. Willie died of typhoid in the White House, and Thomas, or Tad, died of TB at age 17 in Chicago. But I want to talk a little bit about Robert because he was a pretty important guy. One fall, he was going back to Harvard Law School, and he was at Union Station in Washington when he lost his balance and almost fell onto the tracks in the path of an oncoming train. A total stranger reached out and pulled him back. That stranger was Edwin Booth, the brother of John Wilkes Booth. Robert became the Secretary of War for Garfield and Arthur, and he was the last minister to the Great Britain. After him, everybody became an ambassador. The one thing about Robert that's important here is that he sealed his father's papers for 30 years. So on July 26, 1956, Robert died in the 80s. He's buried at Arlington Cemetery, not far from John Fitzgerald Kennedy. So on July 26, 1956, at precisely 12 midnight, Carl Sandburg, Ulysses Grant III, Bruce Catton, and 20 or 30 other people were allowed into the room to view Lincoln's papers. So all the books that you see that were issued before 1956 are historical value, but they do not have reference to Lincoln's papers. Now, how did Abraham Lincoln become the 16th president of the United States? That's a relatively unknown Midwest lawyer, country lawyer, became the 16th president, and here's how he did it. In early 1860, he was invited to speak at a church in Brooklyn, New York. The response to that advertisement was so great that they moved the speech to Cooper Union Hall in Manhattan. And in this speech, which was in February of 1860, he began by reminding the jam-packed audience that of the 39 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 21 voted to give the federal government the power to control slavery. The ayes would have been 24 if Hamilton, Franklin, and Gouverneur Morris had been present. In the second part of the speech, he held that John Brown was a very brave person, but it was a violation. What he did in Harper's Ferry was a violation of the law, and it was futile. He concluded with these memorable words, and listen carefully, this is amazing. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it. The crowd went crazy. He left the hall and walked over to the Brady studio for a photograph, which was circulated over the whole country. That was the photograph that appeared in almost every newspaper in the country, along with the text of the speech he gave at the Cooper Union. On the way over, he met a historian, a guy named George Bancroft. Now, George Bancroft asked him, hey, where are you going from here? Are you going home? And Abe said, no, I'm going up to Massachusetts to visit my son, who's at that time he was at Exeter in Massachusetts. But he went to every New England state and he gave speeches before he went back to Springfield. The Republican Convention was an incredible experience. It was held in Chicago in the summer of 1860 in a building called the Wigwam. Lincoln's men infested the building. Jesse Fell and Ward Hill Lamon printed duplicate tickets and gave them to gave all of them to Lincoln supporters. Now we have to do a sidebar here because you have to know more about Ward Hill Lemon. He was an extremely important person. He was a lawyer from Illinois. He stood about 6'2". He weighed about 250 pounds. He carried 2 revolvers and a Bowie knife on his belt. He was a tough guy. He also had a wonderful voice. So when all these friends, all these lawyers who did the circuit in Illinois met and had dinner or drinks or whatever, Lincoln would tell stories, some of them risque, and Ward Hill Lemon would sing these songs. Lincoln appointed Lemon Marshal of the District of Columbia after he was elected president. Ward Hill Lemon followed Lincoln around everywhere that Lincoln went. He was not at Ford's Theater on the 14th of April, 1865. For years, I wondered why Lemon wasn't there. Some idiot who left his post and went to get a few drinks was the only person guarding Lincoln that fateful night. It seems that Lincoln, on April 12th, ordered Lemon to go to Richmond to see about getting Virginia back into the Union. Every day of his life after the assassination, Ward Lemon lamented the fact that he was not present at Ford's Theater on the 14th of April, 1865. So Jesse Fell and Ward Lemon printed these tickets, and then Lincoln supporters, Leonard Swett, Orville Browning, Gustav Kerner from Kansas, Lyman Trumbull, and others went from delegation to delegation soliciting support. Most important was a lawyer from Illinois who was Lincoln's campaign manager. His name was David Davis. He weighed about 350 pounds, and he was brilliant. Lincoln telegraphed, I was going to say emailed him, but Lincoln telegraphed Davis and ordered him to make no contracts that would bind me. And I quote, "Make no contracts that would bind me." That didn't exactly happen. There is strong evidence that Davis made a deal with the Pennsylvania delegation to give Simon Cameron, who was the leader of the Pennsylvania delegation, a place in the cabinet if Pennsylvania would go for Lincoln after the first ballot. Now, the winner needed 234 votes to win the nomination. Now, at the end of the first ballot, Seward of New York had 173.5, Lincoln had 102, Bates from Missouri had 48, Cameron, remember Cameron from Pennsylvania had 50.5, Salmon Chase of Ohio had 49. Now remember, you needed 234 votes. On the second ballot, Lincoln got 231.5. When the result was announced, before they announced any other, Ohio moved to switch 4 votes to Lincoln. Other states immediately followed. And then the Seward men, who Seward was expected to be the nominee, he was in his garden in Auburn, New York, waiting to be telegraphed to come and give the speech. So Lincoln was on the second, after the second ballot, nominated to be the nominee for the Republican Party. Now, the Democrats in that election split into three parts. Stephen Douglas, who was the other member of the Stephen Douglas debates in the 50s, John Breckinridge, who was a vice president to one of the presidents, and John Bell were running against Lincoln, which made it pretty good for Lincoln. The night after his nomination, Lincoln thought about the people who could advise him. He jotted down 8 names on a blank card: Lincoln, Seward, Bates, Dayton, William Dayton of New Jersey, Judd as Norman Judd of Illinois, Salmon Chase of Ohio, Blair of Maryland, and Wells of Connecticut. And what he wound up doing was he made Seward Secretary of State, he made Bates Attorney General, he made Chase Treasury, Blair Postmaster General, Wells the Navy, and somebody out west named Caleb Smith Secretary of the Interior. And guess what? Cameron became the Secretary of War. And I have to read you a little blurb about what Lincoln said about his brain. He said, "I am slow to learn and slow to forget that which I have learned. My mind is like a piece of steel, very hard to scratch anything on it, and almost impossible after you get it there to rub it out." The guy was amazing. He's my second favorite president, but he was the greatest president we've ever had, I think. Now, Cameron, as Secretary of War, only served a short time. Word got around that he was taking some kickbacks on military contracts. And so Lincoln didn't know really what to do with him. And so this story reminded me of the rabbi in Fiddler on the Roof, when he was asked to say a prayer for the Tsar. And he said, you know, he had a prayer for the Tsar, and it was to keep him as far away from us as possible. And that's what Lincoln did. He sent Cameron to Russia as the minister. Couldn't get much further. And he appointed Edwin Stanton to be Secretary of War, who was a great Secretary of War and a great friend of Abraham Lincoln. The first inaugural took place on March 4th of 1861. The morning was dull and nasty. By noontime, the sun had come out, everything was sparkling, and Lincoln was sworn, and he proceeded to his inaugural address, but he couldn't find a place for his hat. He was wearing a pug hat. So Stephen Douglas, who was sitting close by, reached over, took the hat, put it on his lap, and Lincoln went on with speech. The address is 703 words. I'm going to read you the last 2 paragraphs because they are amazing. Remember now, this is March 4th of 1861, and 7 states had already seceded from the Union. You know, South Carolina and the deep southern states, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. The usual suspects. And Lincoln, have anybody seen, everybody I guess has seen the picture Lincoln? Well, he spoke like the guy who played Lincoln. But his voice carried. in the picture Lincoln, he mumbled a lot. When he spoke, he didn't mumble. He had a high-pitched voice, and it carried out over the 25,000 people who were present. Remember, the Capitol building was not finished. The dome was not on the Capitol, but he was on the east portico of the Capitol building, and he said, and he's talking to the seceded states to the south. He's saying, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and heartstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely as they will be, by the better angels of our nature." It's amazing. Has anybody in this room heard of Edmund Ruffin? Edmund Ruffin. Good. Edmund Ruffin was a big-time farmer from Virginia. He owned slaves. He was well known throughout the country. He was a fire reader. He was a secessionist. He was a slave owner. He took a train to Charleston, South Carolina, where at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, he fired one of the first shots of the Civil War when he pulled the lanyard on a cannon. The cannonball was aimed at Fort Sumter, federal Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. After the war's end, at age 71, Edmund Ruffin committed suicide. The federal 85-man garrison at Fort Sumter that's Fort Sumter. What was left of Fort Sumter after the cannonade? The federal 85-man garrison at Fort Sumter was commanded by Major Robert Anderson. Among the federal troops was Captain Abner Doubleday. Has anybody heard of Captain Abner Doubleday?
Started baseball, didn't
What did he do?
he? Baseball.
Wrong. Abner Doubleday was accredited by 3 guys in Cooperstown, New York, of discovering, inventing, whatever, formulating baseball. He had nothing to do with it. All his life he disclaimed the fact that he discovered baseball. The guy who did was a New York volunteer fireman by the name of Alexander Cartwright. And it happened in September of 1845 when he wrote the rules. Now, I want to go back a little bit. In 1859, the U.S. Marines under Colonel Robert E. Lee stormed the engine house at Harper's Ferry, killing many of John Brown, everybody's heard of John Brown, John Brown's men, including 2 of his sons. Brown was captured, tried, and hung. Now, Robert E. Lee's father was Light Horse Harry, a Revolutionary War hero. Robert married Mary Custis, the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington. They lived at Arlington, which, as you know, is now a national cemetery. The mansion and the grounds were taken from the Custis family and then restored to the Custis family by the Supreme Court. The issue was whether or not they paid the taxes or they didn't pay the taxes. The Supreme Court ruled that they paid the taxes, that the grounds and the mansion belonged to the Custis family, and with that in mind, they did sell the area, the mansion and the grounds to the federal government, and it is now the National Cemetery. After turning down General Scott's offer to command the Union Army, Lee resigned his commission, and when Virginia seceded from the Union, remember now, the 7 states seceded, and 3 others followed them. The last state to secede from the Union was Virginia, and Virginia seceded from the Union on April 18th, 1861, and Lee accepted a commission from Confederate President Jefferson Davis to join the Confederate Army as a general. He led the rebel forces in West Virginia. Really wasn't West Virginia. West Virginia didn't become a state until way later in the Civil War. 44 counties in Virginia became West Virginia. But he led those forces where he was outfought by the feds under George McClellan. Actually, George McClellan didn't have much to do with it. The Battle of Rich Mountain was the big thing out there, and he sent word back to Washington that he was the guy that did it, but he wasn't. He spent some time as Davis's military advisor, and when General Joe Johnson took a bullet in his shoulder at Fair Oaks, Virginia, Lee became the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, and he experienced tremendous victories at Second Bull Run, at Fredericksburg, and at Chancellorsville. He absolutely outfought Pope at Bull Run, Burnside at Fredericksburg, Hooker at Chancellorsville, but he made some mistakes. Wasn't perfect. His mistakes were Antietam, Malvern Hill, and Gettysburg. We're going to discuss a little bit about Antietam and Gettysburg because the Romeos, by the way, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. The Romeos the word Romeo stands for retired old men eating out, like that guy did. Ed Wolf. You missed it, Ed. There's a little footnote here that I'd like to tell you about. At the end of the war, Lee signed an amnesty paper, which would have granted him citizenship. He sent the paper to Seward, Secretary Seward. Seward gave it to a buddy of his, and it was not found until 1970. Now, Lee died in 1870, but the allegiance to the government, to this country, was not found. So what happened was President Ford restored Lee's citizenship on August the 5th, 1975. Okay, now we're getting to the action. The first big battle of the Civil War was at Bull Run. On Bull Run, Virginia. Bull Run, Virginia is about 25 miles maybe from Washington. the little town is called Manassas Junction, but we call it, the Northerners call it, I hate to say this, there's some Southerners in here. We call it Manassas, we call it Bull Run. The rebels call it Manassas Junction. And what happened was members of Congress got in their buggies, they got their wives and lunches, and went out to visit the battlefield, to view the battlefield. Well, what happened was the North was routed. I mean, it was a terrible rout. There was a little bridge there going across the Bull Run Creek when everybody got caught up in it, and they had to hurry, they didn't eat their lunch. They had to scurry back to Washington, otherwise they would have been captured. Now there was a family that lived on or very near the battlefield. The head of the household was Wilmer McLean. After the shooting stopped, Wilmer decided to move somewhere quiet and safe. So he moved his family into the house in Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee surrendered to Grant. Interesting. During the Bull Run fight, a Southern general by the name of Bernard B.E.E., screamed at his men, and I quote, "Look over there, Jackson is standing like a stone wall." 15 minutes later, B was killed. Next, I would like to talk about a battle that made U.S. Grant. It was the battle at Fort Donelson on the Tennessee River. It happened in February of 1862. It's in the West. U.S. Grant commanded, the rebels were commanded by a General Billow, and the rebels missed an opportunity to break out. They were surrounded. There was an Admiral Foote was on the river with his gunboats and was shelling the fort, and Grant, of course, was surrounding the fort. They had to surrender. So Pillow sent a captain with a white flag out to meet with Grant, saying that we would like to surrender. What are the terms? So Grant had another general there, his General Smith. In fact, his nickname was Baldy. And he turned to Baldy and he said, "Baldy, what do you think we ought to do with this guy?" "Well, what terms do you think we should give?" And he said, "Well, I think we should give him unconditional surrender. U.S. Unconditional surrender." So he sent the guy back. The guy came back and told General Pillow, "Unconditional surrender." Now Pillow said, "Wait a second. Oh, an unconditional surrender? I'm getting out of here." He said he turned to a general named Floyd. Now Floyd is an interesting guy because he was the Secretary of War under Buchanan, and he sent 115,000 muskets, and assorted cannon to the Southern Armory, so that when the war broke out, the South was pretty well supplied with arms and ammunition. So Floyd said, "Well, I can't surrender. They'd probably hang me." So he said to the other general that was there, a guy named Simon Bolivar Buckner. It's an interesting guy because he and Grant were buddies. They had fought in the Mexican War, and they knew each other very well. So Floyd and Pillow fled. They escaped. Buckner surrendered to Grant unconditionally, tried to hand him his sword. Grant refused to take the sword. But something funny happened, because it turns out that Grant owed Buckner some money. So he reached in his pocket and he took out the money and he paid Buckner before they sent him off to the prison camp. There is another part of this which is really significant. The only really competent general that the South had in Fort Donelson was a guy by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Now, you have to remember that name because, first of all, Nathan Bedford Forrest was not a military man, but he was probably the greatest or the best cavalry general in the whole war. He was a slaver. He bought and sold slaves in Mississippi. He was extremely wealthy. He paid for his men's 2,200 men, the horses, the uniforms, the weapons. And after the war, he founded the KKK. He was the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. All right, that's the Bull Run battlefield. That's what's left of the Henry House Hill. The Henry Hill house at the battle. Another one. That is Stonewall Jackson. I'm not going to discuss Chancellorsville, but he was wounded at Chancellorsville on May 1st of 1863. He died 10 days later. He was shot in the arm. They amputated his arm. They took him to a farmhouse about 10 miles from the battlefield, and he developed some kind of illness, and they couldn't save him, and he died. The interesting thing about the arm, they buried the arm near the farmhouse, and the rebels, the Lost Cause people, built a monument over the arm, which is interesting. Next, we're going to go to Shiloh, which was fought on April 6th and 7th of 1862. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. That, everybody knows who that is, right? That's
Right.
Unconditional Surrender Grant. Like to take a nip once in a while, but otherwise was a great general. The rebels were commanded by a guy named Albert Sidney Johnson. And on the first day, there was a surprise attack by the Rebs, and they drove the Union forces back to the river and to the Shiloh church. Yeah, give it a shot. Let's see what happens. Oh, that's Nathan Bedford Forrest, the KKK guy. One more. Okay, hold it there. Now, they were forced back to the church and to the river. And the only fact that saved the Union Army was a guy by the name of Prentice. General Prentice held the Hornet's Nest, a little area about a mile from the river, to about, what was it, 5:30 p.m. before he surrendered. And the Union reinforcements began arriving, and the forces that were arriving were commanded by a guy named Lew Wallace, L-E-W, Wallace. Now, that name is significant because after the war he wrote a book called Ben-Hur, and it made one of these, the actor who was an NRA guy, very famous. So the next day, the rebels were routed. General Johnson was killed on the afternoon of the first day. He was shot in the knee and fell off his horse. They couldn't find where he was shot. By the time they found where he was shot, he was dead. He had bled to death. And now, I want to tell you about this little guy here. This little guy here, at the time, was 10 years old. And in about 1864, maybe late 1863, a songwriter wrote a song about Johnny Clem, the drummer boy of Shiloh. Was very famous at the time. Problem was, Johnny Clem was never at Shiloh. He came to the 82nd Michigan Regiment to drum. He was a drummer, 10-year-old kid, ran away from home. He wanted to join the army. They wouldn't let him join the army, but they let him drum. After about a year or two, they let him join, but he was wounded. He drummed at Chickamauga, and he was wounded twice during the war. And he became the Army's youngest non-commissioned officer, and he retired as a brigadier general and he died in 1937 at the age of 86 years. Now, Johnny Clem is a funny thing because he was dying to go to West Point. And every time he took the exam, he failed. He failed the exam. After the Civil War, he was never in combat. He didn't go to Mexico. He stayed in Washington, did administrative things. But he did become a general, and he didn't die until 1937. And there he is, without a struggle.
Excellent.
Now I want to talk a little bit about Antietam. By the way, Antietam is maybe, what do you say, Spence? 2.5 hours?
2.5, yeah.
Maybe 2.5 hours from this room. It is the battle in which became the bloodiest day in the history of the United States. 23,500 people either died or were wounded in Antietam in one day. And it's amazing because McClellan, who was commanding 70,000 plus troops, and to Lee's less than 40,000. By the way, Lee came to Antietam, Maryland, because he thought the people in Maryland would jump to join him, would in droves come and build up his manpower. Very few Marylanders came to join him. I don't know why, but what happened earlier was that Lincoln heard that Maryland legislature was going to meet to vote on secession. So Lincoln locked up the whole legislature. He had them all locked up. They all submitted request for habeas corpus. Habeas corpus would mean that they would be released from the prison until they were tried. He suspended habeas corpus. The Chief Justice almost had a heart attack. So they were all in jail, and Lee got no help from the citizenry of Maryland. But McClellan had Lee's plans. He found one of his non-coms found the plans that a Confederate major had dropped in a cigar tin, and he picked it up. The plans got to McClellan, and McClellan said, and I quote, said to a guy named Gibbons, General Gibbons, he said, and I quote, "If I can't whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." Right. In Antietam, the Battle of Antietam, the feds came in from South Mountain, the passes in South Mountain, and they first came to a place called Miller's Cornfield. And the Rebs met him at Miller's Cornfield, and there was just wholesale slaughter. A general by the name of Mansfield was shot dead in Miller's Cornfield. Then the battle shifted a little bit to the East Woods and the West Woods, and the Dunker Church. That's the Dunker Church, and some of the Confederate dead in front of the church. The Dunker Church, the Dunkers were German sect Christian, and the church is standing. There is a church there that we saw when we went. However, it burned down in like 1919, and they just rebuilt it. There's nothing inside; it's an empty thing, but it is a replica of that building. So after the Dunker Church, there came the Bloody Lane. That's some more of the Antietam dead. Bloody Lane. See, now that's a tower. I think Mike climbed that tower. You climbed that tower, Mike? Yeah. And this is where the Confeds, the rebels, hunkered down in that, and they just murdered the Union guys that were coming, attacking. The Union guys were coming from the north, and the Southern guys were defending from south to north. And the fellow who was leading the Irish Brigade, and they were the ones who were trying to get the Confederates out of the Bloody Lane. As a matter of fact, in a half an hour, that general lost 560 guys, killed, dead, trying to get into Bloody Lane. They finally did. The guy's name was General Thomas Marr. He's Irish. And I got to do a little sidebar on Thomas Marr. He was an Irish revolutionary. The British looked for him for years, couldn't find him. He was causing all kinds of problems in Ireland, all kinds of problems. Finally, they found him and they locked him into jail. And I still don't know, to this day, how he got out of jail. It could be that he escaped, or the British said, listen, we're going to put you on a boat and we're going to send you to New York, and we don't want to ever see your face again in Ireland or England. So he came to New York, got to New York, he landed. When he landed in New York, frickin' New York Irish greeted him as a hero. He was a big time guy, Thomas Marr. And when the war broke out, he raised the Irish regiment and fought at Antietam. And after the war, by the way, although the Irish Brigade did fight again in other battles, they were never, ever the same after Antietam. They just got almost wiped out after that battle. After the war, Lincoln gave Marr a minor position out west. And one night in late 1860s, he was on a riverboat on the Mississippi, and he was booting them up like he liked his Guinness and his Irish whiskey. They went to bed. He left where the party was, and nobody ever saw him again. So he's somewhere in the Mississippi, but nobody ever found him, never surfaced. I guess he was weighted down. Now, after Bloody Lane, the battle then drifted south to a place called Burnside's Bridge. Well, it really wasn't Burnside's Bridge then, it was the Middle Bridge. And Burnside tried to get over that bridge. He could not get over that bridge. We got over that bridge, Spence, right? We got over that bridge. Of course, we didn't have any opposition. And the water in the creek was less than waist high. I mean, they could have gone, they didn't have to go over the bridge. They could have gone, waded the river. They got over the bridge about 1:30 in the afternoon, and Union guys thought they had it locked up. But just then, a guy by the name of A.P. Hill, Ambrose Powell Hill, had come up from the south, where he had captured about 10,000 Union guys, and he held Burnside in check. So then it got dark, and the battle stopped, and on the 18th of September, Lee crossed over the Potomac and went back into Virginia. 30 days later, Lincoln fired McClellan. Now, Antietam is more important than just the battle and the fact that McClellan got the sack. This is Lincoln and talking to McClellan after the Battle of Antietam.
Show him which one's McClellan.
And this is, what?
Show him which one's McClellan.
Oh, McClellan is here. By the way, he sent him home. Where do you think McClellan went? McClellan went to New Jersey. What happened in New Jersey? Well, nothing really, but he became the governor of New Jersey. Now, this picture, see the way it is? There's another chair over here. And in that chair sits Ward Hill Lamon. So Lamon followed him all over. And Lincoln visited the troops maybe 12, 13 times. Give it a click. No, hold that, don't. Now I want to talk a little bit about the Emancipation Proclamation. because it fits in after the Battle of Antietam. It was written by Lincoln, contrary to what people believe. A lot of people believe. It was written by him in the War Department's telegraph office. He gave each of his day's writings to Major Eckert, who ran the office, with instructions not to allow anyone to see it. He told Eckert that things were going bad, and I quote, "We must change our tactics or lose the game." On July 22nd, 1862, Lincoln shared the proclamation with his cabinet. The document read in part, I'm just reading just a little part of it. It declared all persons held as slaves within any state wherein the constitutional authority of the United States shall not then be practically recognized or forever free. Now, it didn't do much really, because all those slaves that were in states that were not under the control of the federal government, he really couldn't free them, except that they began deserting. The blacks began deserting the plantations, the cities, and as a matter of fact, the Union Army had 175,000 black men fight for the Union. That's a lot of guys, and they were fighting for freedom. So then, after he reads this document to the cabinet, he says, what do you think we should do? And Stanton and Bates says, you have to issue it immediately. Chase was a little cool, but he was for it. Postmaster Blair said no. Remember, Postmaster Blair's from Maryland. The Secretary of Interior, Smith, is against, but Seward, old wise Seward, said, if you issue that document now, this is July 22nd, Antietam was September 17th. If you issue that now, it will be viewed as and I quote, the last shriek on the retreat. He said, you mustn't issue this document until you have a victory. And that victory was viewed as Antietam, very shallow victory. Gettysburg is less than 2.5 hours away from here. The Romeos made 2 trips to Gettysburg. First trip, we bought the services of a park guide, a battlefield guide. We had him for 4 hours, and we got in and on. You know, the problem was Ed's car was a little narrow, and so we were a little squeezed in the back. The 2 guys in the front, the guy got in the car and drove. So that left what, 4 of us in the back? No, 3 of us in the back. I think Daniel was in the front. Anyway, I'm not going to do much with Gettysburg, except to say that it happened on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of July, 1863. It started when A.P. Hill's, Ambrose Powell Hill guys came up the Chambersburg Pike toward Gettysburg, and they were met by one of my favorite people, John Buford, a cavalry guy whose men had repeating rifles, and which was a big help because the southern guys only had these muskets that you could only fire once. So Buford held off the AP Hill, the Ambrose Powell Hill boys, until about 9 o'clock in the morning. The 12th Corps under Major General John Reynolds, who was a Pennsylvania guy, came up, and his men sort of solidified or stabilized the line. And Buford left Reynolds. He wasn't gone from Reynolds for about, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes, when a rebel sharpshooter shot Reynolds dead, and he fell off the horse. Now, in case any of you go to Gettysburg or any other Civil War battlefields, and you see a statue with a general on a horse, and the horse's 4 feet, 4 paws, hoofs, are on the statue, that means he survived the battle unwounded. If one hoof is in the air, he was wounded. If 2 hoofs are in the air, he got it. He bought his ticket.
What the fuck?
He bought his ticket. Reynolds bought his ticket early on the first day. Now, what happened after the first day is the Union got, I have to tell you that the Union had 90,000 troops and the rebels had 70,000 troops. So there was an inequity there. On the second day, the big deal was in the left. I'm not a military guy, but it was toward the left flank. And there was a general by the name of Daniel Sickles from New York. He was a politician general. He got his appointment because he was a politician general. He was a member of the House and subsequently would be a member of the Senate. Meade, who was the commander of the Union Army at Gettysburg, just about 8 days, he got his command from Lincoln after Reynolds refused, and Lincoln had no confidence in Hooker at all. So Meade, who was from Philadelphia, in fact the Meade House is on 6th Street near Independence Hall, not too far from Independence, south of Independence Hall, on 6th Street. So this idiot, who, by the way, the guide that we had thought that Sickles did the right thing, but he didn't do the right thing, because when he moved his people forward into a peach orchard and a wheat field, he created a salient, he created a space, so his flanks were not covered. And Longstreet, the Confederate general, observed this and sent his guys. They crushed him, crushed Sickles' guys, and then Meade had to come and order those people back into their line. And Sickles got shot in the leg, and this is interesting too. So he got shot in the leg, and when you get shot in the leg or got shot in the arm, chances are some doctor is going to get a saw and cut it off. That's what happened in the Civil War. A lot of legs, a lot of arms. If you saw Lincoln, you saw the pile of arms and legs. So Sickles lost his leg. Now, after the war, he ran for political office, and what he would do, he had stuffed the leg, and he would take it with him on the campaign. He would campaign with the leg. He would hold it up. Say, "Oh, look, I got shot at Gettysburg." But the real hero of Gettysburg, saved the Northern Army, was a guy by the name of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. He was a colonel at the time, a colonel. And he was on the extreme left flank of the Union Army. And the rebels on the second day figured if they could get Little Round Top, they could place cannon up there and lights out for the Union guys. And these Alabamans on the base of the hill attacked. They ran 10, 11 times. By the 11th or 12th time, the Chamberlain's guys ran out of ammunition. Had nothing to do. So what did Chamberlain do? And by the way, Chamberlain was not a military guy. He was a professor at Bowdoin College in Maine. And when the war broke out, he formed the regiment called the 20th Maine. And that's what he commanded at Gettysburg. In fact, his brother was with him as well. In fact, there was a movie, I think, called Gettysburg, and it did the Chamberlain thing. But it really happened. At the 12th charge, Chamberlain told the guys that were left to fix bayonets and charge down the hill. And when they did that, the Alabamans that were down there, they just dissolved. Now, you see this picture? That's a picture after the Gettysburg was over, the battle was over. And it's a Confederate who was killed, and see, this is where he first led. And then a guy by the name of Alexander Gardner, who worked for Brady, came along and said, "No, that doesn't make such a hotsy-totsy picture." So he set it up. He moved the body. The guy died in a place called Devil's Den, which is below the Round Tops. It's a bunch of boulders. When you go there, you'll see it. It's an ugly, ugly place. The Romeos were there. And we didn't charge down the hill. But we
You wanted to, though. You did want to.
Yeah, I would have charged. Anyway, that happened on the second day. And since I'm talking about Chamberlain, I want you to know that this guy was wounded 6 times during the war. He was wounded most seriously at Petersburg. And at Petersburg, on the spot, Grant promoted him to general. On the spot, at Petersburg, where he lay wounded on the field. After he recovered, he was well enough to go to Appomattox Courthouse, where Grant appointed him to accept the surrender of Lee's army. So he was one of 3 generals who did accept the surrender of these 28,000 rebels. That's all Lee had left, was 28,000 people. At the 50th reunion of the Battle of Gettysburg, Chamberlain was there. He was then commander of the Army of the Potomac. He was also governor of Maine. He's a wonderful guy. See, do I have any? Oh yeah, I forgot the most important thing. On the 3rd day at Gettysburg, you all know what happened on the 3rd day of Gettysburg. They call it Pickett's charge. It really wasn't Pickett's charge. I mean, he was there His guys were in the charge, but he was only one brigade out of 8. The other 7 brigades were commanded by other people. And Lee made a mistake. He had a big argument with Longstreet about whether or not to do the charge. Longstreet wanted Lee to move to the right, and Lee said, "Your orders, General, are to make the charge." And so from about 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock, there was a big bombardment, the rebel bombardment. The problem with that bombardment, they had about 80 some odd guns. The shells were too high. They went over the northern guys who were in the line at the small stone fence. We saw the small stone, copse of trees, small stone fence. And the commander of the artillery for the Union was a guy named Hunt, and he said, "Hold your fire, don't wait with your fire with the guns." And then these people, the rebels, started walking across the field. It must have been a hell of a sight. 15,000, all in a line, all with muskets, and they marched, and they got fairly close to the Union line, and the guns opened up, and all hell broke loose. But about 200-300 rebels made the Union lines, but it was hopeless. They were done. And then Lee decided that he had to go back to Virginia. And Lincoln, it's a big victory. Gettysburg was a big victory. I want to tell you what Lincoln said about Gettysburg. He sat down at his desk in the White House on the second floor, and he wrote this memo to George Meade, dated July 14th, 1863. It's one of the documents that was found in 1956. He said, "Again, my dear General, I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. He was within your easy grasp, and to have closed upon him would, in connection with our other late successes, have ended the war. As it is, the war will be prolonged indefinitely. Your golden opportunity is gone, and I am distressed immeasurably because of it." Now that's a pretty severe kind of thing. And what he did was, he opened his desk drawer, he put it in, he never sent it to me. So after Chattanooga, when Grant came east, Meade was kept as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. But Grant became a lieutenant general. He controlled everything. And I don't know how to describe Grant, except to say that he started at Wilderness, which was in Virginia. He couldn't make any headway, but instead of retreating like any other Union general did, he moved to the left, he moved to the left, he moved to the left, until finally, what they call it, the Overland Campaign, he wound up in Petersburg, which is very close to Richmond. He lost 55,000 guys. 55,000. It says it boggles the imagination. Anyway, let's go to the last battle that Grant fought in the West before he came east. It was at Chattanooga, Tennessee, November 24th and November 25th of 1863. They had Braxton Bragg commanded the rebels, and of course Grant the Yankees. There was two positions. The rebels were on the mountain, on Lookout Mountain, and they were on Missionary Ridge. And Grant and Sherman and a guy named George Thomas were down, and the plan was to attack that. Sherman was on the right flank. George Thomas was in the middle, and Grant and Thomas were on their horses, were looking at the mountain. They called this the Battle Above the Clouds. And the Union guys started out and it's running up the mountain. They went over the top of the mountain, over Missionary Ridge, and routed Bragg's army. Now, the reason I'm telling you about Chattanooga is because the lead captain on that charge up the mountain was a guy named Arthur MacArthur. Now, Arthur MacArthur was the father of Douglas MacArthur. Arthur MacArthur won the Medal of Honor at Chattanooga. Douglas MacArthur won the medal in the Philippines, the only father and son to win the Congressional Medal of Honor. Both win the Congressional Medal of Honor. And here's another little crazy thing. George Thomas was a Virginian. He married a girl from New York. He stayed in the Union. General Pemberton, who commanded in Vicksburg, was a Pennsylvanian who married a girl from Virginia. He went south. I got to tell you something. Hey, is it getting too late? It is. All right, let me. I got to tell you this because if you go down to Washington and you go to the Lincoln Memorial, you can read what I'm going to read you. Do it. That's Sickles before he lost his leg. That's the cemetery at Gettysburg. When you go, you'll see the cemetery. By the way, they've erected a monument where they think that Lincoln stood when he gave the Gettysburg Address. That's not where he stood. There was a picture discovered in the 1990s that places him about 75 feet. We learned this at Gettysburg when we went.
Is that it?
No.
Hold that picture. I got to take this. This is the second inaugural. The picture of the second inaugural. If you go to the portrait gallery at the Smithsonian, you will find this man here. Can you see where I'm pointing? That's Lewis Payne, one of the conspirators in the assassination of Lincoln. He actually almost killed Seward. Next to him is Georgie Esteban. Now he was supposed to kill Johnson, the vice president. He chickened out at the last minute. Didn't help him any. He got hung anyway. Up there on the south portico, up there is John Wilkes Booth. Now this picture is small, but when you go down to Washington and you go to the portrait gallery, you'll be able to see Booth up there. I'm not going to do anything about the assassination. It's getting too late. It's like 8:20 already. Is it 8:20?
Yep. Time flies when you're having fun.
And I didn't even have a glass of water. Now, in March of 1865,
Do I need a picture?
No, you're good.
Lincoln was inaugurated. Prior to that, things looked pretty bad, but Sherman sent him a telegraph that he had, in September, that he had taken Atlanta. And Sheridan sent him another telegram telling him that he had routed Early's army at Cedar Creek. So that made things a little better. When the second election was Lincoln running against McClellan. Incredible. He got 2,500,000 plus votes. McClellan got 1,805,000 votes. But he got up on this over here. He was 6 feet 4 inches.
Yeah, we need to
tall.
get one of these.
He said, he concluded, this is his speech, promising to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. And this last paragraph is for a president to say things like this. Yet, if God wills it, that the war, continues until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the last shall be paid by another with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago. Still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. It's incredible. Do you have time for another story? Or you want
Sure, go for it.
You got another story? Yeah. Walt Whitman loved Lincoln. He absolutely loved Lincoln. He spent most of the war years as a government clerk and nurse in Washington. He never met Lincoln. Never met Lincoln. He would leave his boarding house in Washington each morning and stand on a street corner to wave at the president, who traveled from the old soldier's home to the White House in his open carriage. After Lincoln's assassination, Whitman composed an elegy, E-L-E-G-Y, to Lincoln. And it goes like this. When lilacs last in dooryard bloomed, and the great star Carrie drooped in the western sky, in the night I mourned and yet shall mourn, with ever returning spring, Trinity sure for me bring, lilac blooming perennial, and drooping star in the west, and thought of him I love, with the you'll have to excuse me. With the tolling bells perpetual clang, hard coffin that slowly passes, I give you my sprig of lilac. It's incredible. He did write he wrote Captain, My Captain, but I like that one. I got lots of stories, so if you want to hear stories, I can give you a story. I'll give you one real quick. Before the war, Grant, who liked to imbibe a little, was in a saloon in Galena, Ohio. And he was in this gym mill, and a bunch of thugs jumped him. And he was really getting beat. But in walked a guy by the name of Eli Parker. And Grant and Eli Parker wiped the floor up with these guys. Now, Eli Parker was at Appomattox. He was a general at Appomattox. Why was he a general at Appomattox? Because he saved Grant's life. Also, he was a full-blooded Seneca Indian chief. He was chief of the Seneca Indians. I gotta do this. After he died, after he was assassinated, and we didn't do anything on the assassination, a lot of people wrote in the newspaper about what they thought of Lincoln. And a fellow by the name of Leo Tolstoy, who you all know, right, wrote this little piece in the Herald. It goes like this: the greatness of Napoleon, Caesar, or Washington is only moonlight by the son of Lincoln. His example is universal and will last thousands of years. He was bigger than his country, bigger than all the presidents together, and as a great character, he will live as long as the world lives. Good night.
Nice.